Good morning. Nice to see so many bright and shiny faces at 10 o'clock, a couple minutes after 10. But it's a pleasure to welcome everyone back to school again. For the folks that have just come today, welcome. For the ones that were here yesterday, welcome back. This is our newest classroom that obviously seats more than you probably remember in the old classrooms. But we knew we were going to need a good crowd to listen to Vijay this morning. And it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Govindarajan, who's been at Tuck since 1985, which means that at least in this group, the classes of 89 and up would certainly know him, and the folks from 84 and back we'll hope to get to know him a little bit here in the next hour. But Vijay is our strategy innovation guru, and he's been widely recognized in many publications as being a great teacher and researcher, and hopefully in the next hour you'll see why. And it's a pleasure to in your materials there, if you've checked in, there's a long extensive bio on Vijay, so I won't go into that. It'll take half the time probably. But he wanted me to mention that he was up until 1 o'clock this morning watching the Red Sox. So I told him he should have gone to bed, that they were. But anyway, so please take it easy. Never give up, right? But so please he asked that you take it easy on the questions because he was up kind of late last night. But with that as an introduction, can everybody hear me okay? We've got some extra hearing things if there's a problem. And there are still a few seats left. There's an overflow room next door if a few people come in later. But with that, Vijay, it's all yours. Thank you.
Good morning. I got to tell you, the first time I got introduced to the Boston Red Sox. You see, I came into this country in 1975, and I came to that other famous Eastern Business School in Boston. You see, 1975 was a very important year for Boston and for the Boston Red Sox. They were in the World Series, and Boston had won 2 games. Cincinnati Reds have won 3 games, and the pivotal 6th game was in Boston. And my classmate said, Vijay, you must come and watch the game. And I told them, look, I'm just coming from India. We don't play baseball in India. We play more exciting things like cricket. But they said, no, it's a home team. You got to come and support it. No, not in Fenway Park, but in a television on campus. So I said, okay. That game started at 9 p.m. And those of you who remember, that game went into extra innings. And the game finished around 1:30 or so. And because Boston won, there was celebration. So that night, I went to sleep at 2 o'clock. You see, I'm sort of used to going to sleep at 10 o'clock every day. Suddenly, one day, you go to sleep at 2 o'clock.
Greg, were you able to read?
I kind of overslept and missed my first class session.
Okay, I'll run.
You got to remember, growing up in India, education is sort of drilled into our brains. And sort of missing a class was not even part of something you thought was possible to do. So I was feeling so terribly guilty walking to the second session. In fact, I could see almost my dad come in front of me and said, Vijay, how can you do this? So as I was going to the second session, the students from the first sessions who were coming out, as soon as they saw me, they said, Vijay, do you know what happened in class today? I said, what happened? You were cold called to start the class.
Feeding plant.
My fear instantly turned into my worst nightmare. Not only I missed this class, but the professor and all the students know I wasn't there. So I thought something terrible was going to happen to me. So I just ran to the professor and told him I cannot humble myself enough to say sorry for missing this class. I've never done this in my life. It'll never going to happen. But if there's any consolation, I was watching this game. And this game went till 2 o'clock in the morning. And I wasn't used to going to bed so late, so I kind of overslept. It's not an excuse, but that's really what happened. And the professor told me, look, VG, it's kind of interesting. I knew there was a big game. I knew it went till 2 o'clock in the morning. Therefore, I was looking at the class roster to see who is least likely to watch that game. Take a company like General Electric. It's facing so many big fundamental shifts in the next 20 years, whether it is digital technology, environment, emerging markets, financial issues. For a company like GE, which is trying to remake itself, let's take a look at their 2009 strategic plan and try to look at what projects are they implementing in 2009. And try to put those projects into 3 boxes. How many of the projects any company implements in 2009 will fall into box 1, which is all about managing the present, improving the performance of today's businesses? How many of the projects a company implements in 2009 will be in box 2, which is about selectively forgetting the past? And how many of the projects a company implements in 2009 will be in box 3, which is about creating the future? Manage the present, box 1. Selectively abandon the past, box 2, and create the future, box 3. What I find working with organizations is organizations over-focus on box 1 and think they do strategy. Is box 1 important? Absolutely. Is box 1 critical? Absolutely. Is box 1 strategy? No. Strategy is really about box 2 and box 3. And the challenge in box 3 is, how are you going to create your future in the year 2030? And if you want to create your future in 2030, you also have a job to do in box 2. Namely, you have to selectively forget. Let me clarify one thing right away. Strategy for any organization, it includes General Electric, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and every organization in this room, is about leadership in the year 2030. But strategy is not about what you do in 2030. Strategy is very much about the projects you're going to implement in 2009 across the 3 boxes so that you intersect with 2030. How are you allocating resources in 2009? How is the organization's energy focused in 2009 across the 3 boxes so that you stay relevant in the next 20 years? Another word for box 1 is competition for the present. And I say strategy has nothing to do with competing for the present. Another word for box 2, box 3 is competition for the future. I say strategy has everything to do with competing for the future. But one thing we know, competition for the present is extremely important. Competition for the present is just as important as competition for the future is. Therefore, strategy is really about how do you create your future while managing the present. How do we shape the evolution of 2030 when you are squarely implementing projects in 2009? And the reason this is a challenge is the thinking process it takes to succeed in box 1 is fundamentally different than the thinking process it takes to succeed in box 2, box 3. Yet in 2009, you better have projects in box 1 targeted at 2009. But in 2009, you better have projects targeted at box 2, box 3, targeted at year 2030. Yet there are fundamental conflicts between those 2 types of projects. That's the strategic challenge. That's the leadership challenge, which I have been sort of exploring for the last 30 years. How can large organizations fundamentally create the future while managing the present? Let me just highlight what the tension between competition for the present on the one hand and competition for the future on the other. Competition for the present Box 1 projects are always in response to linear changes in your environment. Because the changes in the industry are linear, the organizational response would be incremental improvements in your current business model. Call it Six Sigma quality. Call it continuous process improvement. Call it operational excellence. These are all Box 1 concepts. Competition for the future, Box 2, Box 3, on the other hand, is always in response to non-linear changes in the environment, discontinuous shifts in the industry, fundamental changes in the industry. Because the changes are non-linear, the organizational response in terms of Box 2, Box 3 projects is always about non-linear shift in your strategy, fundamental business model innovation. What might be an example of a non-linear shift? If you want to take a look at the last 15 years, I would say the internet itself was a non-linear shift. Why? Non-linear shifts will force organizations to remake themselves. Non-linear shifts will make new business models possible. Concepts like eBay, Amazon.com, Google would not have been possible without a non-linear shift called the internet. What might be examples of non-linear shifts, say looking at the next 20 years? Certainly technologies, not just digital technologies, but all kinds of technologies will fundamentally transform almost every industry in the next 20 years, for sure. But technology is not the only source of non-linear shifts. There could be huge customer discontinuities. Customers of the future could be fundamentally different than the customers of the present. If they are fundamentally different, they are also going to demand fundamentally new business models. There could be non-traditional competitors who could come into your space and force you to remake yourself. There could be huge demographic shifts, lifestyle changes that could open up all kinds of opportunities for organizations. Let me give you an example of a customer discontinuity, which is just about impacting all organizations. I'm talking about emerging markets, the so-called BRIC countries. Even if you don't want to focus on all the 4 BRIC countries, let's take a look at 2 of them, I and C, India and China. Every report that I read indicates in the next 20 years, India and China will grow very, very aggressively. Strategy for General Electric, strategy for P&G, strategy for Johnson & Johnson, strategy for every organization in this room has to be to ask the question, how do I participate in that growth? But here is the catch. The catch is growth in emerging markets cannot be captured through Box 1 approach. We cannot take business models we created for the American customer in Box 1 and simply send them over to India or China. Perhaps adapt them locally. That's not going to do it. Why? Because emerging markets represents a huge customer discontinuity. Customers in emerging markets are fundamentally different than the customers in developed markets. If they are fundamentally different, they are also going to demand fundamentally new business models. A company which did not understand this and therefore paid a very, very heavy penalty is Ford Motor Corporation. Incidentally, Ford is the better of the 3 automobiles, come in to think of it. When the Indian economy opened up in the early 90s, Ford decided to enter India. And Ford also knew that Indian consumer cannot afford to buy an ultra-luxury passenger car. Therefore, what Ford decided to do was to take one of their Box 1 business models from the US, targeted at middle America, priced in the US for about $20,000. They decided to take that platform into India. Before they sent that platform into India, they wanted to adapt it for Indian conditions. And one of the ways they try to adapt it for Indian conditions is to take unnecessary cost out of that automobile platform. If you can take unnecessary cost out, you can bring down the price point. That's always good. So they put together a design team in Detroit to figure out what's good for India. I'm pretty sure your companies don't do things like that. And one of the places the design team decided to take cost out was in the power windows. Instead of having power windows on all the 4 doors, the design team said, well, Indians could do with power windows on just the front 2 doors. Well, did it bring down the cost in that automobile platform? Sure. Therefore, they could price it less. Now, what happened in India? Someone in India who can afford to buy, say, a $15,000 automobile is typically extremely rich. That Indian tends to have a chauffeur. So the chauffeur got the power window. I am not making this up. This looked like a perfectly logical way to enter India when you are wearing the Detroit lens. Incidentally, this is not the bad part of the story. The really bad part of the story is even if Ford intelligently customized that automobile for Indian conditions, at best they can capture 10% of the Indian population. That's all that can afford a premium business model designed for the US customer adapted in India. Incidentally, markets like India and China are big because there are a lot of people. You try to go after the top 10%, those markets are not that big. But if you want to capture the remaining 90% of the opportunity in these emerging markets, you better think in box 2, box 3 terms. As you well know, early part of this year, an Indian company, Tata Motors, launched a $2,000 car, Tata Nano. Just to tell you how incredibly innovative this automobile platform is. $2,000. A DVD player in a BMW costs more than $2,000. $2,000 is the cost of 10 iPods. That's the entire automobile. Now, let's just pause for a moment and ask ourselves the following question. What is the market opportunity Tata Motors saw for a $2,000 car in India? And how come Ford failed to see the same opportunity? The mistake Ford made is the same mistake every American multinational makes. That is, when they go abroad, they make a simple assumption. And that simple assumption is customers abroad are similar to customers at home. Once you make that simple assumption, that the customers abroad are simply a linear extension of the customers at home, all that you need to do is to take the business model you created for the US customer and simply adapt it for local distribution, local culture, etc. Let's see how this would have played in the case of Ford. Think about for a moment, who is the customer for Ford in the US? It's an American who is driving an automobile. And then Ford wants to persuade that American to buy a Ford automobile instead. So they took that mindset into India. And in the early 90s, they tried to identify a subset of Indians who were driving an automobile. And then wanted to persuade them to buy a Ford automobile instead. Again, think about who in India might have been driving a passenger car in the early 90s. If an Indian had a passenger car in the early 90s, more than likely that Indian had a passenger car for decades. Even when the Indian economy was not open to foreign competition, they managed to have an automobile. That means these are extremely, extremely wealthy Indians. Movie stars, industrialists, rich folks who can afford to pay the very heavy price tag, very heavy import duties, and still manage to import a Mercedes, a BMW, a Rolls-Royce into India. Good luck trying to convert a Rolls-Royce customer into a Ford customer. What Tata Motors is looking at is the non-consumer for automobiles in India today, namely the two-wheeler population. Those of you who have gone to India, you see the entire family travels on a two-wheeler, husband and wife and 4 kids. In fact, even today, 90% of the vehicles sold in India are bicycles, two-wheelers, and three-wheelers. Two-wheelers are priced at $1,500. You make an automobile for $2,000, you can migrate the two-wheeler population into a four-wheeler population. Here is what I'm pointing out. When there is a customer discontinuity, you're creating new consumption. You're creating the new industry. When you are creating new consumption, you cannot start with your box-owned business model, which is created for a rich customer, and try to adapt it there. And the reason there is a customer discontinuity in India or China or any other emerging markets is because of the paradox of emerging markets. And the paradox is emerging markets are mega markets, no doubt, with micro customers. Think about the per capita income in India, it's $800. Contrast that with the per capita income in the US of $50,000. There is no business model you created for the US customer where the mass market per capita income is $50,000. You can simply go and adapt it in India where the mass market per capita income is $800. Let me give you a better example. 5 years ago, Procter & Gamble in China, they had a market dominance in their 45-cent premium Pampers diapers, which they were selling for the tier 1 segment in China. And 5 years ago, they had a dream. And that dream was to unlock a whole new market in the tier 3 segment in China by creating a 10-cent diaper. Now, why did P&G have this dream? Incidentally, in a tier 3 household, typically the child does not wear a diaper. Or at best, the child wears a cloth diaper, which can be repeatedly washed. For a moment, imagine a tier 3 household in China. A child is not wearing a diaper. And typically, as you know, the child sleeps with the parent. Imagine in the middle of the night, the child wets. The parents have to get up. So P&G was asking itself the question, what would the tier 3 household be willing to pay for a good night's sleep for the parents? And in a tier 3 household, the grandparents are always sleeping in the adjacent room. So when the parents wake up in the middle of the night, the grandparents also have to wake up. So P&G was asking itself the question, what would the tier 3 household be willing to pay for a good night's sleep for the adults? P&G also found out if a child sleeps peacefully at night, the child becomes more intelligent. And given their one-child policy, certainly they want the child to be intelligent. So P&G was asking itself the question, what would the tier 3 household be willing to pay for a good night's sleep for the adults, and making their only child super brilliant? The cost of breakfast in a tier 3 household is 10 cents. So they were asking themselves the question, would the tier 3 household be willing to pay the cost of breakfast to get all these customer benefits? Here is my point. You want to create a 10-cent diaper, do not start with your 45-cent diaper and try to knock off 35 cents. It will never happen. You have to reinvent the diaper from the ground up. Here is my real point. In the next 5 years, in fact, Tata Nano is being launched in 2010 in India. I was in China a couple of weeks ago. P&G is rolling out the 10-cent diaper. When these things happen, they will not stay inside those markets, is my point. When the Tata Nano becomes a reality in India, it's going to start to disrupt automotive markets in the rest of Asia, in Europe, back in the US. The reason why American companies must take customer discontinuity and emerging markets seriously is because it's going to fundamentally change the American corporations in the next 20 years. The question is not what Ford can do to help India. The real question is what can India do to help Ford? The issue is not how Ford can transform automobile business in India. The real question is how can India transform Ford's global automobile business? One of the metaphors that I like for box 1, 2, 3 thinking is a metaphor from sports. What I have here is the gold medal winners in high jump in Olympics. Olympics, I suppose, started in 1896, so we have about 100 plus years of data here. When you plot the 100 years of data of gold medal winners in high jump in Olympics, what you immediately see is there have been 4 non-linear business models in the high jump industry. And only when the business model fundamentally transformed could the high jumper go to the next level of performance. In fact, the first style in high jump was scissors. And I got a picture of the scissors there. If you don't understand that picture, what happens in scissors is really the hurdling motion. In fact, I would bet you, even today, if someone asks you to do high jump, you will probably use scissors. Think about it. Suppose you're walking on the road. You find a little rod. What do? You kind of jump over it, just like the way a hurdler would jump. Inside of every one of your organizations, there are lots of scissors. When scissors is the style in high jump, and if you're a high jumper, you have a job to do. What is the job? Accept the rules of scissors and become the #1 person in the scissors in the world. This is what I call operational leadership, box one thinking. Watch your customers, watch your costs, watch your market share, watch your bottom line. Is that important to do? Absolutely critical. We have to continuously perfect our scissors. Why? Because our scissors still has a lot of useful life left in it. You better put money to make the scissors perform better. But this is what I'm trying to point out. In 2009, 100% of the projects that you undertake cannot be to perfect the scissors. You can do that if the world will never change. Unfortunately for us, the world keeps changing. New customers arrive, new technologies arrive, new competitors arrive. Incidentally, with scissors, high jumpers could do about 5 feet 2 inches. If scissors was still the style in high jump, we would not be able to achieve the performance we are achieving today. As you well know, in the recently concluded Beijing Olympics, the high jumpers were well above 8 feet. The reason being, if you use the scissors, which is a hurdling motion, then the center of gravity will define how much you can lift your body. If you use the hurdling motion, the center of gravity defines how much Six Sigma you can do to that jump, how much continuous process improvement you can do to that jump. If you want to break out of the center of gravity, you must change the business model. And that's what somebody did and came up with a Western roll. And I got a picture of the Western roll here. If you don't follow that picture, what happens in Western roll is you run up to the pole, you kick off of your right foot, you clear the bar, but unlike scissors, you still land on your right foot. So if you're going to kick off of your right foot and still land on your right foot, that means your back is to the pole when you clear the pole. Can you visualize that? I'm certainly not planning to demonstrate that for you. Western roll was in vogue for about 25 years until someone invented the Eastern roll or the straddle. And again, as the picture shows, what happens in straddle is you run up to the pole, you kick off of your right foot, you clear the bar, but unlike Western roll, you land on the left foot. So if you're going to kick off of your right foot and land on the left foot, your belly is to the pole when you clear the pole. And that was in vogue for about 25 years until someone invented the flop. To no one's surprise, it was invented by, Fosbury flop was invented by Dick Fosbury in the '68 Olympics. As the picture shows, what happens in the flop is you run diagonally to the pole. Then you launch yourself with 2 feet straight up in the air. And once you launch yourself like that, then you twist your body. In fact, the twisting motion was one of the breakthrough ideas of Dick Fosbury. The twisting motion allowed him to break out of the center of gravity and elevate quite a bit high. Again, imagine you're running up to the pole, launching straight up, twisting your body. That means you are still straight up. Therefore, as the picture shows, the very first thing that crosses the bar is your head. In fact, Dick Fosbury fundamentally changed one of the assumptions high jumpers used to make. Historically, the high jumpers assumed leg must clear the bar first. In the flop, actually, head clears the bar first. Then it is your neck. Then it is your back. In fact, the leg clears the bar the last. You literally land on your head, so to speak. This is the challenge for organizations. This is the leadership challenge. When you have your scissors, you better make money with your scissors. But simultaneously, have projects which will transform that scissors into Western roll, Eastern roll, flop to something else. Let me ask you a question. If you can raise your hands, I can call on you. Tell me, how come people who are very good in scissors are not the ones who come up with Western roll? This is certainly true in high jump. People who are the dominant players in the scissors era were not the ones who came up with the Western roll. Why is that? Yeah, yeah.
Because they are succeeding with the old technology.
That's right. It's interesting. The very success in box 1 creates the traps in box 2, box 3, isn't it? That's interesting. Is there anyone in this room who doesn't want to succeed in box 1? Please don't say yes. That's not the right answer. We must be world class in performance in our current business model. That's the right thing to do. How come the right thing to do also becomes the wrong thing for the future? It's interesting. Why the success in scissors itself sets up the traps? Why is that? What do you think, Satya? Part of it may be when we are so successful in our current business, that means we really understand our customers well. We understand our competitors well. We understand our business model well. Perhaps there is an unlearning problem for us. Therefore, we cannot think something different. It's interesting. In fact, in Beijing Olympics, there was a big buzz. There is going to be a whole new style in high jump. If someone asked me what that could be, I am a prisoner to the flop. So I can't even imagine what you could do differently. But maybe that's our problem when we are so successful. Any other reason why people who are dominant scissors don't innovate?
I think there's also a risk reward. If they could figure out if they could do the flop, they would. But because it's the unknown, and there's a risk of potentially the curve going the other way, it's safer in many regards to continue performing and getting more efficient at your scissors.
That's right. In fact, if I am outstanding in scissors, if I try anything else, I know I'm not going to be outstanding there first. And it's very disturbing to us to do something poorly. We only do things well. We don't do things poorly. If I ask you to go back after this alumni reunion and start doing things poorly, you say, what is that? I only do things well. So maybe that's our problem. And we see the risk. If we don't succeed in Western roll, we also potentially are giving up something we are good at. Any other reason we?
Because it disrupts your existing business. I mean, you're basically making your existing business obsolete. And to think like that is pretty difficult when you're trying to do it.
Part of it also has the potential to disrupt what we are doing today, what we are good at, and that's kind of could be potentially threatening as well. Tell me, when you are doing scissors, who do you think your competitors are? That's a problem too. We have a very myopic thinking about when we go into strategic planning sessions, which competitors do we analyze is the question. If you continue to analyze people that you fully understand, you're going to be always in scissors. Again, tell me, when you are outstanding in scissors, when you go to the gym, what kind of exercises do you do to make you better at scissors? Incidentally, those exercises are useless for Western roll. Because Western roll asks you to build different muscles. It makes different assumptions about center of gravity. Again, part of what I'm asking you to think about is, in your strategic plan, when you go to have a conversation about your strategic plan, which core competencies do you focus on? Core competencies that will support our box 1 business. Do we think about going to the gym and doing different exercises, building different muscles is a question. Perhaps what I'm trying to point out is, I want you to go and honestly ask yourself the question by taking a look at your strategic plan for 2009 and ask yourself the question, how many projects you have in 2009 which will be in box 1. And box 1 is all about performance gap. You're trying to close the performance gap in your scissors. And how you do it is through something called restructuring. Sometimes we say re-engineer, downsize, right size. Is that important to do? Absolutely critical. But what I am saying is, how many projects you have in your 2009 strategic plan, which will be in box 2, box 3. And box 2, box 3 is all about closing opportunity gap. Another word for opportunity gap is growth gap, innovation gap. You cannot close opportunity gap by simply restructuring your scissors. You have to renew that scissors. You have to transform that scissors. You have to reinvent that scissors. Perhaps this is what I'm trying to point out. For every organization in this room, if you want to be a leader in the year 2030, your opportunity gap is a lot bigger than your performance gap. What are you doing in 2009 to address that opportunity gap? In fact, whenever I'm with CEOs, I typically ask them, show me your 2009 strategic plan. Tell me 3 projects you're implementing in 2009 to become a leader in 2030. If the CEOs tell me we are working on enterprise resource planning, time-based competition, total quality management to become a leader in 2030, I typically tell them, welcome to 1970. Perhaps they still listen to Barry Manilow, who knows? You can't get to 2030 by pressing those buttons. They're important, but they are box 1 issues. They are performance issues. They are table stakes. They are nothing more than best practices benchmarking. Incidentally, best practices benchmarking is not strategy. Think about what you do when you do best practices benchmarking. You look around your industry. You look around players who are playing by rules similar to yours. Then you ask yourself the question, is there anyone in my industry who is playing by those rules better? Then you try to measure the gap between yourself and the industry leader. Then you try to put in place programs to close that gap. Imagine, what are you going to look like at the end of that process? How can you aspire for leadership in the year 2030 by just doing that? That's like saying, suppose you're in a locker room and you want to find out how bad your sock smells. Don't go benchmarking your socks against other people's socks in the locker room. They're all going to smell about the same. Incidentally, we do this all the time in business schools. When tech school wants to reinvent the curriculum, what do? We do a best practice benchmarking. We go collect the brochure from Harvard Business School and Wharton and Stanford. What are you going to learn by smelling Harvard socks? Not a whole lot. But they're doing the same thing that you're doing. Strategy is not about doing best practices. Strategy is about creating next practices. Strategy is about, in my opinion, strategy is innovation. Strategy is value creation. Strategy is about next practice. Tata Nano is not a best practice. It is about next practice. If this country has to remain great in the next 50 years, we got to come up with next practices. Just like the way a gentleman by the name Henry Ford in the early 20th century opened up a whole automobile industry by a simple next practice called, if we can create a $600 automobile, then there will be a huge non-consumer who will become consumer of automobiles. The whole industry was born. Model T, simple product. Somehow we have forgotten that when we go to India. The Ford forgot we have to create consumption there. Let me give you another example of next practice. Microfinance. You see, the microfinance revolution, which Dr. Muhammad Yunus started from Bangladesh. He won a Nobel Prize, as you know, for a couple of years ago. Dr. Muhammad Yunus is actually a college professor. He teaches economics in Bangladesh University. And what happened was, Bangladesh is prone to famines. And in the early 80s, 1983, there was a big famine in Bangladesh. And 166 people from his village were starving to death. So he went to the local bank and he said, there are 166 people who are dying, and all that they need is $25 loan. If you can give them $25 loan, you can save 166 lives. And the commercial bank did their usual risk analysis and concluded these customers are high risk. They may probably die anyway. I'm not going to get the money back. Sorry, we are not going to lend this $25 to them. Then Dr. Muhammad Yunus looked at his pocket. He had $25. He said, I don't need the $25. So he lent it to these 166 folks. Something interesting happened. Not only the 166 lives were saved, but he got 100% repayment. And he made a profit because he charged 10% interest. You see, those villagers were used to borrowing from local money sharks at 10% interest per day. So they were borrowing at 3,650% per annum. So when he only charged 10% per annum, that looked like a pretty good deal. So he made money. Then he said, wow, this is brilliant. I made money with these 166 folks. Why don't I start a business? Let me start a bank. There's money to be made here because a lot more poor people in Bangladesh. But you see, he doesn't know how to start a business. See, that's why he was teaching, you see. As the saying goes, if you can, you do. If you can't, you teach. So he was teaching. So he said, I want to start this business, but I don't know how to start the business. So he went to the local bank and said, you know what, I want to start a bank, but I don't know how to start a bank. What do you do in a bank? Tell me what you guys do. So he patiently wrote down everything that commercial bank did. And then he started his own commercial bank, Grameen Bank, with exactly the opposite rules. He said, if those rules, best practices, are not going to serve this uncontested space, the only way I can create this market is by next practice. And common sense tells me next practice has to be opposite of what these guys do. If commercial bank lend to the rich, I will only lend to the poor. The commercial bank lends thousands of dollars, the best I'm going to give is $15 loan. If the commercial bank lend to the men, I will only lend to women. If commercial bank operate in urban areas, I will only operate in rural areas. If commercial bank have risk officers and write contracts, I will have none of that stuff. If commercial bank ask people to come to the bank to get the loan, I'm going to take the bank to the people. As you know, Grameen Bank in 2008, at the height of the financial crisis, they gave US $5 billion loan. Incidentally, Grameen Bank, at the height of the financial crisis, was the only commercial bank which was financially sound. It was the only commercial bank in the world which did not require government bailout because he based it on next practice. He based it on common sense. As you well know, his concept is based on self-help groups. Depositors become borrowers. They constitute themselves in self-help groups, groups of 9. There's a leader and 8 members. And that self-help group decides who will get the first $15 loan. So you don't need contracts, you don't need risk analysis, you don't need nothing. And if any member of that 9-member team does not repay the loan, that group will never get another loan. So that's their way to reinforce repayment. I was talking with Dr. Muhammad Yunus recently, and I asked him, have you pushed this next practice beyond what you created in 1983? He said, Vijay, I've done many things. But something that I'm very proud of is 6 months ago, I decided to extend commercial banking to beggars. You see, beggars are the lowest of the lowest in totem pole. They are the bottom of the pyramid. I am pretty sure Bank of America or Citigroup will not target them as a potential profitable customer base. So he said, you know what, I thought I will extend commercial banking to beggars. So 6 months ago, he went to about 10 beggars in Bangladesh and said, you know what, each one of you got $15. They were saying, what do we need to do to get this $15? He says, nothing, just take it. You're now a bank customer. And as you know, microfinance is always connected with micro enterprise. So they always give you some skills in a micro enterprise to do something with that $15. He said, this is what I want to train you to do. He said, you know what, you're going begging every day, door to door. When you're begging door to door, why don't you ask those people whether they need something? Maybe they need vegetables. Maybe they need toys. Maybe they need cookies. Use your $15 to buy whatever they want. Of course, you charge a profit because you're saving them time and effort and so on and so forth. You keep the profit, give me my $15 and 10% interest. If you do that, next month I will give you $20. That's the way for him to make sure the beggars stay in as permanently as part of the customer base. He was telling me, Vijay, you know what? I created this system 6 months ago. And I was thinking I will enroll about 100 beggars in this system. In 6 months, he has got 200,000 beggars as customer base of Grameen Bank. Incidentally, out of those 200,000 beggars, 50% of them, 100,000 of them have become door-to-door salesmen. They gave up begging. They said, this is a pretty good business model. Out of the remaining 100,000, 50% of them, 50,000 of them have decided to stick to their core competence. Begging. They said this selling is too complicated. Another 15,000 decided they could do both. There were some houses which were good for begging. There were some houses which were good for selling. See, even without a Tuck MBA, they did market segmentation beautifully. Whether you know it or not, Grameen Bank now operates in the US. They are transforming the lives of US consumers in Katrina, in Jackson Heights. This is my point. All those innovations, in fact, emerging markets today, in my mind, is the biggest discontinuity for growth for corporations. Just like the way internet was the biggest growth engine in the last 20 years. Information technology in the last 20 years. Customers moving from rich countries to poor countries is going to be the biggest growth engine in the next 25 years. Whether we talk about health, Obama's healthcare reform is anchored on 3 pillars: low cost, increased access, good quality. Guess what? That is the only 3 pillars by which the healthcare market will get unlocked in India. And if you can unlock it in India, you can bring those solutions to the US. This is my main point. The problems emerging market faces today requires box 2, box 3 solution. And it is the same problems US is going to need to address in the next 25 years. Let me just give you one example and then we'll wrap up. Think about how General Electric has prospered in the energy sector in the last 150 years. In fact, electricity is part of General Electric. Electric is very much in their name itself. How have they prospered? They prospered in an energy industry in the US, which is based on a very simple logic. As you know, energy industry has 2 parts. There is generation of electricity, and then there is distribution of electricity. And the business model we have used in the last 150 years in the US is a very simple business model, which says we will generate electricity through central scale-efficient power plants. The reason we put scale-efficient power plants is big, large power plants, the cost of generating electricity will be very low. Scale reduces cost for generating electricity. Of course, when you have a few central power plants, then the power has to be dragged for thousands of miles to the consumer who uses the power. Therefore, we constructed a national grid, very sophisticated transmission and distribution grid in this country, which can drag that electricity for thousands of miles without any problem. That is the industry which General Electric created. That is the industry where GE sells the large turbine engines to these big, massive utilities. Let's shift the scene to India for a moment. 60% of India lives in the villages. In the villages, you have either inadequate or absent when it comes to transmission and distribution lines. They are either absent or inadequate. If you are General Electric, you have two choices. Choice number one, you can tell the Indian government, why don't you spend trillions of dollars and lay those transmission and distribution lines? Then we will come and do business with you. That's like AT&T telling the Indian government, why don't you spend trillions of dollars and lay the copper wires? Then we will come and give you landline, reliable service in India. Or option number two, let's change the paradigm. How do you change the paradigm? You change the paradigm by having renewables and decentralized power generation as the core of your strategy. Incidentally, every village in India needs its own power supply. Therefore, let's put a power plant in all parts of India. It's interesting, renewables. The main problem with decentralized power generation is decentralized power plants, the cost of generating electricity will be very high compared to the central scale efficient power plants. But renewables gives us a brilliant solution here. In fact, with renewables, you can only do decentralized power generation. Why? Because you got to put the windmill where the wind tunnels are. You can't capture the wind and send to a central place. If you're going to make electricity out of biomass, biogas, cow waste, you got to put the plant where the cow waste is in the village. You can't take the cow waste and ship it all over India. So renewables lend itself to decentralized power generation. Then you don't need national grid. All that you need is a local grid to distribute that power. The reason in my mind, the US, we don't embrace renewables is because of the existing infrastructure we have. The existing infrastructure in central power plants and national grid. We will have to obsolete all of that if tomorrow we went 100% renewable. Whereas India is not constrained that way because they don't have a national grid. Therefore, they are going to lead in the renewable revolution. Guess what? In the next 100 years, somewhere along the line, the physical infrastructure in this country in energy sector has to be rebuilt. And it will not be rebuilt in the same way we built it in the last 150 years. And anybody who is a winner in India, it is not just about winning in India. They will be able to dominate in the US market is my point. The reason we don't embrace electric cars in this country is not because we don't understand the technology. In fact, GM could bloody well introduce the electric car a long time ago. The reason we will not embrace electric car is because of our existing infrastructure. In fact, if 100% electric cars we went tomorrow, which we are perfectly capable of doing, we have to obsolete all our internal combustion engine, gasoline-driven cars. We have to close down all our gas stations. China or India is not constrained that way. The very first car a Chinese customer, a bulk of the Chinese customer will buy will be an electric car. This is my point. Companies which begin to seize on these problems and build those platforms are the ones which are going to succeed in the US market is my point. Let me perhaps close with this. Think about what organizations do when their business model begins to show signs of becoming obsolete. What do organizations do when their scissors runs out of steam? What do organizations do when they are faced with a dead horse? Top 11 things we can do with a dead horse. The question is, have you tried any of this inside your company? How about number 11? Have you tried this? How about number 10? How about number 9? How about number 8? Still all right? How about number 7? How about number 6? How about number 5? Number 4? 3? And number 1. Let me just conclude. Incidentally, if you leave your business card, if you want my presentation slides, and I got other things, I'll be more than happy to email them to you. But let me just close with the following observation. In fact, what I'm trying to tell you is a very, very simple message. In fact, the message is so simple. You may say, Vijay, why are you spending so much energy delivering a simple message? Because the message is simple does not mean it is easy to do. It is very, very hard. The simple message is future is now. Future is not about what you do in the future. And the reason this is so hard is if you're an executive, today you have 2 jobs. One job is to make your today's businesses profitable. Another job is to invest in the future. And there are inherent conflicts in terms of resource allocation, people, capabilities, metrics. Incidentally, this box 1, 2, 3 thinking is not just for business. In fact, this is an alumni reunion, great opportunity for you to reflect on your own careers. We're amongst people who are at similar stage in their career. Think about box 1, 2, 3 is the only way as human beings we can continue to be a leader. You have to reinvent yourself if you want to continue to be a leader. If you don't reinvent yourself, you die emotionally. You die, in some sense, intellectually. And the same principles apply. Use this weekend to take some time out for yourself. What is the future you want to create? What are the box 1, 2, 3 initiatives that you need to have in your portfolio? Thank you very much for the opportunity to work with you today, man.